Maya Winters never thought she would end up as someone who took care of old people for a living. That wasn't the plan at all. With her music degree from the state university and big dreams of performing on stage, working as a caregiver hadn't even made it to her list of backup plans. But life has a funny way of redirecting our paths when we least expect it. After graduation, Maya had jumped from one temporary job to another, waiting tables at the corner diner, teaching piano to uninterested children whose parents insisted they needed culture, and filing paperwork at a dental office where the fluorescent lights gave her headaches by noon each day. 3 years of this had worn her down. Her student loans weren't going anywhere, and her tiny apartment's rent kept climbing. So when her neighbor Patty mentioned that the home care agency she worked for needed someone reliable for a new client, Maya found herself nodding yes before she'd even heard the details. "It's not so bad," Patty had told her over cheap wine and microwave dinners. "This old professor needs someone there during the day. He gets confused sometimes, needs help with meals and medicine, but he's not bedridden or anything. The family's paying good money too." 2 weeks later, Maya pulled up to a small cottage on the edge of town. The garden was overgrown but still showed signs of someone's past care. Rose bushes fighting through weeds and a stone path now partially hidden by grass. The house itself looked like something from an old storybook, with its blue shutters and wraparound porch, though the paint was peeling in places and one of the steps creaked dangerously under her weight. Harold Pembroke answered her knock with suspicion in his pale blue eyes. He was tall and thin, his back slightly bent with age but still holding himself with a dignity that immediately told Maya this man had once commanded respect in lecture halls. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice clear despite the slight tremor in his hand as it gripped the doorframe. "I'm Maya, Mr. Pembroke. From the home care agency. I called yesterday to let you know I'd be starting today." He stared at her for a long moment, and Maya wondered if he was having one of the confused spells Patty had warned her about. Then his face cleared. Yes, the agency. "Come in then. I don't need you, you understand? But my son seems to think I do." Maya followed him inside, taking in the modest living room filled with books on every available surface. Academic journals were stacked on the coffee table, and framed diplomas hung crookedly on the walls. It smelled of old paper and coffee and something else, the faint staleness that comes when windows haven't been opened in too long. "Your son arranged for the service?" Maya asked, trying to establish some facts as she'd been trained to do in her brief orientation. Harold waved his hand dismissively. "James is too busy to visit, so he sends money and strangers instead." The bitterness in his voice was palpable. This was going to be trickier than she thought. Maya had expected an old man who would be grateful for her help. Instead, she got a proud former professor who saw her presence as an admission of his decline and a reminder of family absence. The first day set the pattern for the weeks that followed. Maya arrived each morning at 8 and found Harold already dressed, though sometimes his shirt buttons were misaligned or he wore 2 different colored socks. She'd prepare breakfast while he sat at the kitchen table reading the newspaper, occasionally making sharp comments about the state of education these days or politicians who couldn't think their way out of a paper bag. She learned to listen with polite nods, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. Her job, as the agency supervisor had explained, was to help with meals, medication, light housekeeping, and companionship. Getting into political or academic debates wasn't in the job description. Harold took his pills with obvious resentment, watching Maya check them off on his medication chart with narrowed eyes. "I taught chemistry for 40 years, he told her repeatedly. "I think I can manage my own medication schedule." But the fact was he couldn't. Maya had found evidence of missed doses and double doses in the first week alone. So she smiled and said, "I'm sure you could, Mr. Pembroke, but this way we both have peace of mind, don't we?" The days fell into a routine. Breakfast, medication, reading time for Harold while Maya cleaned the kitchen and started laundry. Lunch followed by a short walk around the neighborhood if the weather permitted. Though Harold complained the entire time about the changes to houses he'd known for decades. Afternoons were for what Harold called real work. He was writing his memoirs. He claimed, though Maya noticed he often stared at the same page for hours, sometimes forgetting what he was doing altogether. By the 1-month mark, Maya was exhausted. Not physically, the work wasn't demanding in that way, but emotionally. Harold's mood swings were unpredictable. Some days he was sharp and witty. telling fascinating stories about his travels for academic conferences or the famous scientists he'd met. Other days he called her by his late wife's name and became angry when Maya gently corrected him. "I'm just a paycheck to you," he said, during one particularly difficult afternoon, when she'd had to convince him to change his shirt after spilling soup all over it. Another old man waiting to die while strangers pretend to care. The word stung more than Maya wanted to admit, because in some ways, he wasn't wrong. This was just a job to her, a stepping stone until something better came along. She wasn't family. She wasn't even a trained nurse. She was just a music major who couldn't find work in her field, showing up each day for the paycheck that kept her own life from falling apart. That night, Maya sat on her threadbare couch and wondered if she should quit. The agency had other clients. Maybe she could request a reassignment. Someone with dementia required special skills and patience she wasn't sure she possessed. But the next morning, she found herself driving back to the blue cottage anyway. Something about leaving felt like failure, though she couldn't quite explain why. She found Harold at the kitchen table as usual, but something was different. His eyes were red-rimmed and a framed photograph lay before him. A woman with a kind smile and eyes that matched the faded blue curtains in the kitchen. "Elizabeth," he said without looking up as Maya entered. "My wife, today would have been our 50th anniversary." Maya set down her bag quietly. "She was beautiful," she said, unsure what else to offer. "She was brilliant," Harold corrected her. "Far smarter than most of my colleagues, though she never got the credit she deserved. Women in science weren't taken seriously back then." He traced the edge of the frame with a trembling finger. "She helped me with my research for years. Should have been listed as co-author on at least a dozen papers." For the first time, Maya saw beyond the grumpy old man to someone who had lived a full life, who had loved deeply and perhaps regretted much. She realized with a start that she knew almost nothing about Harold beyond what was in his care file. She'd been so focused on completing tasks that she hadn't really seen the person. "Would you tell me about her?" Maya asked, sitting down across from him. Harold looked surprised, then suspicious, as if waiting for her to check her watch or change the subject to medication or breakfast. When she didn't, he began slowly, haltingly at first, then with growing animation as memories surfaced. He spoke of meeting Elizabeth in graduate school, of their shared passion for research, of raising their son James in this very house. He talked of holidays and arguments and reconciliations, of Elizabeth's diagnosis with early-onset Alzheimer's and the cruel irony of a brilliant mind slowly unraveling, of the 10 years he had cared for her himself, refusing all outside help until the very end. "No one could do it right," he said simply. "No one knew her like I did," and in that moment Maya understood his resistance to her presence. She wasn't just a reminder of his own declining independence. She was a painful echo of his past role as caregiver to the woman he loved. "I'm not trying to replace anyone," she said gently. "I'm just here to help you stay in your home a little longer. That's what you want, isn't it?" Harold nodded, suddenly looking very old and very tired. "This house is all I have left of her," he whispered. Something shifted between them that day. Not dramatically, but enough that Maya noticed the difference. Harold still had his difficult moments, still sometimes called her by the wrong name, still resisted help with bathing and changing clothes. But there were also moments of connection, small kindnesses and shared jokes, brief windows where they were just two people sharing space rather than caregiver and client. Maya began to pay more attention, to really see the man behind the diagnosis. She noticed how his hands lit up when he talked about his research, even if he sometimes lost his train of thought mid-sentence. She learned that he took his coffee black but secretly loved sweet things, especially the butterscotch candies she started bringing him. She discovered his dry sense of humor and his genuine delight when birds visited the feeder outside his window. 6 weeks into the job, Maya no longer watched the clock, counting minutes until she could leave. Instead, she found herself wondering about Harold's life when she wasn't there. Did he get lonely in the evenings? Did he manage his dinner okay from the prepared meals she left in the refrigerator? Did he still wake up confused and calling for Elizabeth in the night? She wasn't family. She was still, at the end of the day, just doing her job. But somehow, against all expectations, she had me to care. The discovery happened on a rainy Tuesday in October. Maya had arrived to find Harold more confused than usual, still in his pajamas at noon and insisting it was Sunday, and that Elizabeth would be home from her mother's soon. These episodes had become more frequent lately, and Maya had learned that arguing only made things worse. "Why don't we put on some music while we wait for her?" Maya suggested, hoping to redirect him. Harold's face brightened momentarily. She loves music, always playing her records. Maya had noticed the old record player in the corner of the living room but had assumed, like many things in the house, it was just gathering dust, a relic from a time before streaming services and digital playlists. Now she crossed the room and opened the cabinet beneath it, revealing rows of vinyl albums in paper sleeves. "Which ones did Elizabeth like?" she asked, running her fingers along the edges. Harold shuffled over, the confusion in his eyes clearing slightly as he focused on the familiar objects. "Ella Fitzgerald," he said, pulling out a well-worn album. "This was our favorite." Maya carefully removed the vinyl disc and placed it on the turntable, relieved when it still worked. The warm crackling sound filled the room, and Ella's rich voice singing, "Someone to Watch Over Me," floated through the small house. The effect on Harold was immediate and startling. His shoulders relaxed and a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "We danced to this at our wedding," he said, swaying slightly. "Elizabeth was so beautiful that day. Everyone said I was the luckiest man alive." His eyes grew distant with memory. They were right. For the next hour, they sat together listening to jazz standards while rain pattered against the windows. Harold seemed more present than he had in weeks, sharing stories about concerts he and Elizabeth had attended, about teaching their son to dance in this very room. When the final track ended, Maya looked over to find silent tears streaming down Harold's face. Without thinking, she reached out and covered his gnarled hand with hers. They sat that way for a long moment before she gently suggested they have lunch. That afternoon, when Harold grew agitated about taking his medication, Maya found herself humming "Someone to Watch Over Me" softly. The familiar melody caught his attention and the fight went out of him. He took his pills without further complaint. It was such a small moment, but it sparked something in Maya's mind. The next day, she brought her old iPod and a small speaker, loaded with jazz standards she'd downloaded overnight. When Harold had trouble focusing on his breakfast, she played Moonlight Serenade, and his restless fidgeting stopped almost immediately. Over the following weeks, music became their secret language. Maya learned which songs calmed Harold during his most confused moments, which ones brought him joy, and which ones sometimes made him weep with remembered grief. She found herself researching music therapy techniques in her free time, amazed at the science behind what she was witnessing firsthand. The biggest breakthrough came unexpectedly. Harold was having one of his bad days, the kind where he paced the house looking for Elizabeth, growing increasingly distraught when he couldn't find her. Maya had tried his favorite records, but today even Glenn Miller wasn't cutting through his agitation. Without really planning to, Maya began to sing. Her voice was untrained but true, carrying the melody of "Fly Me to the Moon" softly through the room. Harold stopped mid-pace, his attention caught by the sound. He turned toward her, his eyes clearing slightly. "That's lovely," he said when she finished. "Elizabeth used to sing to our son when he was small." Maya smiled, relieved to have broken through. "Would you like to sit down? I could sing something else." They settled in the living room, Harold in his armchair and Maya perched on the piano bench she'd discovered tucked in a corner behind stacks of books. She sang old standards she remembered from her grandmother, lullabies from her childhood, even a few classical pieces she'd learned during her brief time as a music major. As she sang "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," she noticed Harold's eyes grow heavy. By the final notes, he was dozing peacefully in his chair, the first time she'd seen him nap without restless mumbling and twitching. Maya covered him with a throw blanket and tiptoed to the kitchen to start dinner, feeling a strange sense of accomplishment. Singing to Harold became part of their daily routine. On good days, he would request his favorites and sometimes even join in with a wavering tenor that hinted at a once strong voice. On bad days, her singing was often the only thing that could pull him back from the edge of distress. Maya found herself looking forward to these musical moments. They reminded her of why she'd fallen in love with music in the first place, of the power it had to connect people across all barriers. She began bringing her guitar sometimes, picking out simple accompaniments to the songs Harold loved best. She played pieces she'd written years ago and had almost forgotten, surprised when Harold offered thoughtful criticism or genuine praise. For a man who claimed to know nothing about music theory, he had an impressive ear. "You should be performing," he told her one afternoon after she'd played a particularly moving rendition of La Vie en Rose. "Not wasting your talent looking after old men." Maya shook her head. "I'm not wasting anything. Music is meant to be shared." She strummed a few chords absently. "Besides, I tried the performance route. Turns out I don't handle rejection well." Harold snorted. "Who does? The difference between success and failure is usually just stubbornness." He tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair in rhythm with her playing. Elizabeth wanted to give up her research a dozen times. Too many dead ends, too much criticism from colleagues who couldn't see what she saw. But she kept at it. Did she succeed? Maya asked. Eventually, published a groundbreaking paper on protein folding when she was 52. Pride filled his voice. Showed them all. That evening as Maya drove home, she found herself wondering if she'd given up too easily on her music dreams. She'd auditioned for orchestras, applied to graduate programs, even submitted original compositions to competitions. After a string of rejections, she'd convinced herself she wasn't good enough and stopped trying. But seeing how her simple songs affected Harold made her question that conclusion. Maybe her music wasn't meant for concert halls or recording studios. Maybe its purpose was more intimate, more healing. The thought followed her home and lingered as she fell asleep. The next morning, Maya arrived to find Harold already dressed and in better spirits than usual. "I've been thinking," he announced as she hung up her coat. "You should give lessons." "Lessons?" Maya set down her bag, confused. "Music lessons, here." He gestured around the living room. "That piano hasn't been touched in years, but it still works." Elizabeth had it tuned regularly. Maya blinked in surprise. "You want me to give lessons in your house?" "Why not? It's a big house for one person." "Too big, really?" He waved his hand dismissively. "The agency says you're only supposed to be here 6 hours a day, but I know you could use the extra money. Teach a few students here before or after your shift. I won't tell if you don't." The offer was tempting. Maya had occasionally thought about teaching again, but setting up a studio required space and a good instrument. Both things her tiny apartment lacked. Still, the idea of mixing her professional caregiving role with a personal business venture seemed complicated at best. Unethical at worst. "I don't know, Mr. Pembroke, there are rules about this kind of thing." "Harold," he corrected her. "After all this time, you should call me Harold. And rules are for people without sense enough to know when to bend them." His eyes twinkled with a hint of the professor he once was. "Besides, I'd enjoy the company. The house is too quiet most of the time." Maya promised to think about it, though she had no intention of taking him up on the offer. The agency had strict policies about using clients' homes for personal business, and she couldn't risk losing her job. Instead, she continued their musical routine, noticing with satisfaction that Harold's confused episodes seemed less frequent and less severe when they maintained regular singing sessions. She started keeping a journal, documenting which songs worked best for different situations and how Harold's mood and cognitive state seemed to correlate with their musical activities. One evening, after Harold had gone to bed, Maya found herself drawn to the piano. She removed the stacks of books that had accumulated on its closed lid and carefully opened it to reveal yellowed ivory keys. Pressing one experimentally, she was surprised to find it perfectly in tune. Just as Harold had said, she began to play softly, not wanting to disturb him, just simple chords at first, then a gentle improvisation that expressed the complicated feelings that had been building in her over the past months, the joy of connecting with Harold through music, the sadness of watching his good days become less frequent, the strange fulfillment she found in this job she'd never wanted. Lost in the music, Maya didn't notice when Harold appeared in the doorway in his bathrobe, listening silently. When she finally looked up, his eyes were shining with tears. "Elizabeth would have loved to hear you play," he said softly. She always said music was the purest form of emotion, the language of the soul. Maya smiled, embarrassed to be caught in such a private moment. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't. I don't sleep much these days." He shuffled to his armchair and sank into it with a cig. "Of course, would you play something else?" So Maya played. She played Chopin and Debussy, pieces she'd learned years ago and somehow still remembered. She played old folk songs and show tunes, smiling when Harold hummed along. And when he seemed to be drifting toward sleep, she began to sing softly, a lullaby her mother had sung to her as a child. The moment felt sacred somehow, a gift exchanged between two unlikely friends. As Harold's breathing deepened into sleep, Maya continued singing, her voice barely above a whisper. In this peaceful moment, with rain beginning to patter against the windows and the house creaking gently around them, she felt something shift inside her. For the first time since college, she felt like she was using her music for exactly what it was meant to do. Not to impress crowds or win competitions, but to connect, to comfort, to heal. Maybe this detour in her life wasn't a failure after all. Maybe it was leading her exactly where she needed to go. 20 miles away in a sleek high-rise apartment overlooking the city, James Pembroke sat alone at his dining table. The space around him was immaculate, all clean lines, glass surfaces, and neutral tones that the interior designer had assured him represented modern sophistication. No personal touches interrupted the careful aesthetic. No family photos, no mementos, nothing that might hint at a life beyond work. The tablet before him displayed security footage from his father's cottage. James had installed the system shortly after his father's diagnosis, telling himself it was for Harold's safety. A fall could go unnoticed for hours. A burner left on could cause a fire. The cameras were a precaution, nothing more. At least that's what he told himself on the rare occasions he acknowledged the guilt that prickled at the back of his mind. The truth, that he couldn't bring himself to visit his father but couldn't quite let go either, was harder to face. Tonight, like most nights, James had opened the security app while eating his solitary dinner. It had become a habit over the past 2 years, this distant watching. Usually the scenes were predictable, his father dozing in his chair, or shuffling from room to room, or staring at books he no longer seemed able to read for long periods. But what James saw tonight made him set down his fork mid-bite. His father was sitting in his armchair, looking more alert than James had seen him in months. And the caregiver, Maya, according to the agency reports, was singing to him. Her back was to the camera, but James could see her hands moving in gentle gestures that accompanied whatever song she was performing. More surprising than her actions, though, was his father's response. Harold was smiling. Not the vacant smile that sometimes crossed his face these days, but a genuine expression of pleasure that transformed his features into something reminiscent of the father James remembered from childhood. James turned up the volume on his tablet. The sound quality was poor, but he could make out a sweet, clear voice singing Moon River. The melody transported him instantly back 20 years, to his mother playing the piano in the living room while his father hummed along, to family dinners filled with lively debate and laughter, to the warm sense of home he'd spent the past decade trying to forget. When the song ended, his father applauded softly. "Your voice reminds me of my mother's," he said to the caregiver. "She used to sing in the church choir every Sunday." "I never knew my grandmother's," Maya replied, shifting slightly so James could now see her profile. "Both died before I was born." "A shame," Harold nodded. "Grandmothers are important. Elizabeth would have been a wonderful grandmother." A shadow crossed his face. If James had ever married or had children, James flinched at the mention of his name. He hadn't expected to hear it spoken in that house. "Your son?" Maya asked carefully, and James found himself leaning closer to the screen. Harold's expression darkened. "Brilliant boy. Too brilliant, maybe. Always in a hurry to be somewhere else, do something bigger." Silicon Valley swallowed him up. He shook his head. "We lost touch after Elizabeth died. My fault, probably. I wasn't much good to anyone then." "I'm sure that's not true," Maya said gently. "No, it is. Grief makes monsters of decent people." Harold sighed heavily. "I said things I shouldn't have, so did he. Pride kept us both from fixing it." James set down the tablet, unable to watch anymore. His father's words had struck too close to the complicated truth of their estrangement. The argument after his mother's funeral had been explosive, James accusing his father of neglecting her health concerns until it was too late. Harold lashing out that James had been too busy with his startup to visit, even when they knew the cancer was terminal. Both accusations held enough truth to wound deeply, and neither man had known how to bridge the chasm that opened between them afterward. Weekly phone calls became monthly, then quarterly, then holiday only. When Harold's cognitive decline began, it was his neighbor who called James, not Harold himself. By then, James's company had gone public. He had the resources to hire the best specialists, to set up the most comprehensive care plan. He convinced himself that this was better than his amateur attempts at emotional reconciliation. His father needed professional help, not a son who had no idea how to talk to him anymore. So James had arranged everything from a distance: the doctor appointments, the medication management, the rotating cast of caregivers when it became clear Harold couldn't live completely independently. He paid the bills without complaint and read the weekly reports from the agency, and he watched silently through the cameras that his father probably didn't remember were there. It was enough, he told himself. It had to be. Now watching this young woman sing to his father, watching Harold respond with more animation than James had seen in years, a new feeling threaded through the familiar guilt. Something that felt uncomfortably like jealousy, mixed with a sharp sense of having missed something important. Over the next week, James found himself checking the security footage more frequently. He watched as Maya arrived each morning with a cheerful greeting, as she patiently helped his increasingly frail father through the daily routines of medication and meals. But most compelling were the moments when she sang or played the piano that had sat unused since his mother's death. During these musical interludes, Harold seemed transformed. The confused, sometimes belligerent old man became temporarily lucid, engaged, almost youthful. He shared stories about James's childhood that James himself had forgotten. He laughed at Maya's gentle jokes. He even attempted to dance once, though his balance was clearly too poor for more than a few shuffling steps. Late one evening, James witnessed a particularly moving scene. His father was having what the caregiver's reports called a sundowning episode, a period of increased confusion and agitation that often occurred in the evening hours. Harold was pacing the living room calling for Elizabeth, growing more distressed by the minute. Previous caregivers had handled these episodes with clinical efficiency. Redirection, medication, sometimes gentle restraint if Harold became too agitated. Maya tried something different. She sat at the piano and began to play softly, then to sing what James recognized as an old lullaby his mother had sung to him as a child. At first, Harold didn't seem to notice. He continued pacing, his movements jerky with distress, but gradually the music seemed to penetrate his confusion. He slowed, then stopped near the piano. As Maya continued singing, his expression softened from fear to something like peace. By the final verse, he had sunk into his armchair, his breathing slow and regular. When the song ended, Maya moved to cover Harold with a blanket. As she leaned over him, James heard his father murmur, "Thank you, dear. You have a gift." The simple sincerity in those words struck James like a physical blow. When was the last time he'd done something to ease his father's confusion? When was the last time he'd tried to understand what Harold was feeling, rather than just managing his symptoms from afar? The next day, James found himself distracted during meetings. His chief operating officer had to ask him twice for input on a major acquisition decision. His assistant commented that he seemed somewhere else today. By evening, he had made a decision that surprised even himself. He booked a flight home. 3 days later, James stood on the porch of his childhood home for the first time in nearly 6 years. The house looked smaller than he remembered and shabbier too, though the agency was supposed to be handling basic maintenance. The garden his mother had loved was largely overgrown, with only a few hardy perennials still fighting their way through the weeds. James had timed his arrival for the evening, after Maya would have left for the day according to her schedule. He wanted to see his father alone first, to try to navigate the complicated reunion without an audience. But as he raised his hand to knock, he heard music from inside, the soft strains of a piano, followed by a clear female voice. Maya was still here. Hours after her shift should have ended, James hesitated, his knuckles inches from the door. Part of him wanted to retreat back to his rental car, to return to the impersonal hotel room he'd booked. It would be easier to watch from a distance for a few more days to get a better sense of his father's condition before attempting an actual conversation. Before he could decide, the music inside stopped abruptly. A moment later, he heard his father's voice, raised in a way that sent James straight back to childhood arguments over curfews and college applications. "Elizabeth. Elizabeth, where are you?" The note of panic in the old man's voice propelled James forward. He opened the door without knocking. It wasn't locked, he noted with concern, and stepped into the hallway he'd once raced through as a child. The scene in the living room stopped him cold. His father was standing in the middle of the room, his thin frame rigid with distress, eyes darting around wildly. Maya was beside him, one hand resting lightly on his arm, speaking in a low, soothing voice that didn't seem to be reaching him. "Dad?" The word felt strange in James's mouth after so many years. Both figures turned toward him. Maya's expression showed surprise, but Harold's face underwent a more dramatic transformation. The panic drained away, replaced by a moment of perfect clarity. "James?" His voice broke on the name. "Is that really you?" 3 quick steps brought James across the room. He'd intended a handshake, perhaps an awkward pat on the shoulder, something to acknowledge the years and hurts between them. Instead, he found himself pulling his father into a careful embrace, shocked at how thin and fragile the once robust frame had become. Harold stiffened momentarily, then his arms came up to return the hug with surprising strength. They stood that way for a long moment before Harold pulled back, his eyes moving over James's face as if memorizing it. "You look like your mother," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I know," James replied, because he did know. People had been telling him that since he was 12, though the resemblance had only strengthened as he aged. Same dark eyes, same determined set to the jaw, same tendency to hold feelings too close. A small sound from across the room reminded him they weren't alone. James turned to see Maya watching them, her expression a mixture of confusion and something that might have been happiness. "You must be James," she said, stepping forward with her hand extended. "I'm Maya Winters. I've been helping your father for the past few months." James took her hand, struck by how different she looked in person compared to the distant figure on his security footage. Younger than he'd expected, with a quiet confidence in her bearing that the cameras hadn't captured. "I know," he said, then realized how that might sound. "I mean, the agency keeps me updated. They speak very highly of you." Before Maya could respond, Harold swayed slightly on his feet. Both James and Maya moved to steady him, their hands meeting on his arm. The moment of physical contact seemed to jolt Harold back to awareness. "My son," he announced to Maya, as if she might not have figured it out. "Finally decided to see if I was dead yet." James winced at the bitterness in his father's voice, but Maya didn't miss a beat. "Well, as you can see, he's found you very much alive. Why don't we all sit down? I was just about to make some tea before heading home." She guided Harold gently to his armchair, her movement so natural and unobtrusive that James found himself watching in admiration. This wasn't the clinical efficiency of the previous caregivers. This was something closer to friendship or even family. As Maya disappeared into the kitchen, James took a seat on the couch across from his father. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, filled with unasked questions and unspoken apologies. "I saw you on the cameras," Harold said suddenly, his voice matter-of-fact. James blinked in surprise. "You know about those?" "Of course I do. I'm forgetful, not stupid." Harold's gaze was direct, more focused than James had expected. "You've been watching. Why not visit?" The blunt question deserved an equally honest answer, but James found himself struggling to articulate feelings he'd avoided examining for years. "I thought it would be harder," he said finally. "For both of us," Harold nodded slowly. "Pride. Like I told the girl." His eyes drifted toward the kitchen where they could hear Maya moving about. "She sings, you know. Beautiful voice. Reminds me of your mother sometimes." "I know," James said softly. "I heard her." Harold's eyes sharpened again, fixing on his son's face with sudden intensity. "Why now, James? Why come back now?" It was the question James had been asking himself since he'd impulsively booked the flight. The easy answer was concern over his father's declining health, but that wasn't what had finally broken through his resistance. It was seeing his father respond to music, seeing him connect with Maya in a way that the parade of previous caregivers had never achieved. "I missed you," he said simply, surprising himself with the truth of it. "And I think I've been missing a lot of other things too." The tea was chamomile, served in chipped mugs that James recognized from his childhood. Maya brought the tray into the living room, her movements careful and unhurried as she set it on the coffee table. An awkward silence hung in the air, the kind that comes when strangers find themselves witnesses to a family reunion decades in the making. "I should probably go," Maya said, glancing at her watch. "It's getting late and you two probably have a lot to catch up on." "No." Harold's response was immediate and forceful. "Stay, please. I want James to hear you play." His eyes, suddenly anxious, moved between Maya and his son. "She plays beautifully, like your mother used to." James saw a flicker of something, uncertainty perhaps, cross Maya's face before she nodded. "I can stay a little longer." She sat at the piano bench, her back straight but her hands relaxed as they hovered over the keys. "Any requests?" Harold leaned back in his chair, a smile softening his face. "Something happy. Something from the old days." Maya thought for a moment, then began to play. The melody was familiar to James, one of his mother's favorites, a jazz standard that had often filled the house on Sunday afternoons. As Maya's fingers danced across the keys, James watched his father's reaction. The old man's eyes had closed, his head moving slightly in time with the music, the ghost of a smile playing around his lips. When Maya began to sing, her voice blended perfectly with the piano, not showy or dramatic, but warm and sincere in a way that seemed to fill the room with light. James found himself transported back to family gatherings, to his mother at this same piano, while his father watched her with undisguised adoration. The song ended, and Harold applauded softly. "Wonderful, my dear. Just wonderful." "That was my mother's favorite," James said, surprised to hear his own voice breaking the spell of the moment. Maya turned to look at him, her expression curious. "Your father mentioned she was musical. She was—" James paused, searching for words that could capture Elizabeth Pembroke's passion for music without reducing it to a simple hobby. "Music was her language, I think. The way she connected with people when words weren't enough." Harold nodded, his eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears. "She could say more with one song than most people manage in a lifetime of talking." He glanced at Maya. "This one has the same gift." Maya ducked her head, clearly embarrassed by the praise. "I just have some training. Nothing special." "Music degree from state," Harold informed James with unexpected precision, proving his memory still functioned perfectly in some areas. "Wasted talent hiding out here with an old man." "Dad," James began, uncomfortable with his father's bluntness. "It's not wasted," Maya interrupted gently. "Music is meant to be shared, not hoarded. It doesn't matter if it's in a concert hall or a living room." She smiled at Harold. "Besides, your father is my toughest critic. He's made me a better musician these past months." Harold harumphed but looked pleased. The conversation shifted then, flowing more easily as Maya shared stories about their daily routines. Harold's progress with his memoirs, their walks around the neighborhood when weather permitted, the birds they watched at the feeder outside the kitchen window. James found himself relaxing, drawn into their shared world in a way he hadn't expected. Eventually Maya did leave, despite Harold's protests. James walked her to the door, oddly reluctant to see her go. At the threshold, she paused. "He has good days and bad days," she said quietly, her eyes serious. "Today was a very good day, but don't be surprised if tomorrow is different." James nodded, grateful for her honesty. "Thank you. For everything. The agency reports are one thing, but seeing you with him—" He trailed off, not sure how to express what he'd witnessed. "Your father is a remarkable man," Maya said simply. "Even on his worst days, there's so much there, so much knowledge and humor and heart. Not everyone sees it, but it's always there." After she left, James returned to find his father dozing in his chair. He took the opportunity to really look at the house for the first time since arriving. The bones were the same, the layout unchanged from his childhood, but he noticed new things now. The way Maya had organized Harold's medications on the kitchen counter with clear labels and times. The notebook beside Harold's chair with reminders and schedules written in a neat, rounded hand. The fresh flowers on the dining table and the bird identification guide bookmarked to local species. Small touches that spoke of care beyond what any agency could mandate. Harold stirred and opened his eyes, seeming momentarily confused before focusing on James. "You're still here," he said, sounding surprised. "I'm staying at the Marriott downtown," James replied. "But I'll come back tomorrow if that's okay." Harold nodded, then added with a trace of his old sarcasm, "Assuming you can fit it into your busy schedule." James let the barb pass. "I've taken some time off. Actually, I'm thinking about working remotely for a while, being here more." He hadn't planned to say that, hadn't even consciously considered it until the words were out, but as soon as he spoke, James knew it was true. The company could function without his physical presence for a few weeks. His executive team was solid, and technology made distance less of a barrier than ever. Harold raised his eyebrows but said nothing. After a moment, he changed the subject. "The girl has talent, Maya," James corrected gently. "Yes, she does. Reminds me of your mother sometimes. Not just the music. The way she sees people." Harold's gaze grew distant. Elizabeth could always see past the surface. Past the title or the degrees or the nonsense people put up to hide behind. She saw the person underneath. James nodded, thinking of how Maya had spoken about his father, not as a patient or a case or a burden, but as a man with a lifetime of experiences and knowledge. Mom was good at that. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. James found himself studying his father's face. The deep lines around his eyes, the thinning white hair, the still sharp angle of his jaw. Time had changed him, yet there was still so much of the father James remembered. "I'm sorry," James said suddenly, the words emerging before he could consider them, "for not coming sooner, for the things I said after Mom died, for not being here when you started to—" He hesitated, unsure how to reference his father's condition. "When I started to lose my marbles?" Harold suggested dryly. Despite himself, James smiled. "I was going to say when things got difficult." Harold waved a dismissive hand. "Call it what it is. I'm forgetting things. Important things. Names, faces, what I ate for breakfast. Some days I don't know where I am." His voice grew quieter. "Some days I look for your mother before I remember she's gone." James's chest tightened with a complicated mix of emotions. "Does that happen often?" "More than I'd like." Harold's gaze was direct, challenging. "It's going to get worse. You know that, right? I've read the literature. I know what's coming." The bluntness was so characteristic of his father that James almost laughed despite the gravity of the conversation. Harold Pembroke had always faced facts head-on, a trait he'd tried to instill in his son from an early age. "I know," James acknowledged. "We'll figure it out." Harold raised an eyebrow at the "we" but didn't comment directly. Instead, he said, "Maya helps. She doesn't treat me like I'm already gone. And the music—" He trailed off, seeming to search for words. "The music brings me back. Even on the bad days." James thought about what he'd witnessed over the security feed, how his father transformed during those musical interludes, how the confusion seemed to recede temporarily. "I noticed that. It's remarkable. It's science, not magic," Harold said with a hint of his professorial tone. "Music activates different parts of the brain, neural pathways that aren't affected by the disease, at least not initially." He tapped his temple. "Maya's been researching it. Reading studies, testing different approaches with me." This was news to James. "She has? Smart girl, observant." Harold nodded approvingly. "Been keeping records too. What works, what doesn't. Which songs help with different symptoms." A small smile touched his lips. "She doesn't know I've seen her notes." Very thorough. Very scientific approach. James was impressed despite himself. The agency reports had mentioned Maya's innovative techniques with Harold, but nothing this systematic. That's not in her job description," he said, thinking aloud. "That's what makes her different," Harold replied simply. "She sees a person, not a paycheck." The words echoed in James's mind later that night as he lay in his hotel bed, unable to sleep despite his travel fatigue. He thought about all the caregivers who had cycled through his father's home over the past 2 years. Competent, professional, ultimately forgettable. None had connected with Harold the way Maya had. None had gone beyond the basic requirements of the job to really see his father's needs. And if James was being honest with himself, he hadn't either. He'd approached his father's care as a problem to be solved with money and systems, not with presence. He'd congratulated himself on hiring the best agency, on setting up the most comprehensive care plan, on handling all the financial details without complaint. But he hadn't given the one thing his father might have valued most: his time. The realization was uncomfortable, forcing James to confront his own shortcomings in a way he'd avoided for years. In business, he prided himself on seeing the human element, on understanding that behind every metric and algorithm were real people with real needs. Yet he'd failed to apply that same insight to his own family. The next morning, James arrived at the cottage earlier than he'd planned, carrying coffee and pastries from the local bakery he remembered from childhood. To his surprise, Maya's car was already in the driveway, though her shift wasn't scheduled to start for another hour. He found them in the kitchen, Harold sitting at the table while Maya prepared what looked like oatmeal. They were deep in conversation, something about bird migration patterns, and neither noticed him immediately. James paused in the doorway, struck by the easy rapport between them. His father was gesturing animatedly, explaining something about Canada geese with a clarity that seemed at odds with his diagnosis. "James," Harold spotted him first. "Tell Maya about that time we went camping and got surrounded by geese." The request for a shared memory caught James off guard. It had been so long since he and his father had reminisced about anything. "That was quite a morning," he said, stepping into the kitchen. "I think I was about 10. We'd set up our tent too close to a nesting area, and the mother goose decided we were a threat. 30 pounds of angry bird," Harold added gleefully. James tried to fight it off with a canoe paddle. "While you hid in the tent," James retorted, surprised at how easily the old banter returned. Maya laughed, the sound bright in the morning quiet. "I'm on the goose's side in this story." James set the coffee and bakery box on the counter, suddenly aware of how domestic the scene felt. "I brought breakfast, but I see you're already handling that." "Just oatmeal," Maya said. "But those pastries look amazing. Mr. Pembroke, Harold, has a sweet tooth he thinks I don't know about." Harold looked unrepentant. "A man my age is entitled to his vices." The morning unfolded with unexpected ease. They ate together at the kitchen table, the conversation flowing naturally between shared memories, local gossip, and Maya's stories about her college days as a music major.
James found himself laughing more than he had in months.
Drawn into their established dynamic as if he'd always been part of it. After breakfast, Maya excused herself to start laundry, leaving father and son alone at the table. Harold watched her go with a fond expression that reminded James painfully of how he used to look at Elizabeth. "You could do worse, you know," Harold said abruptly, turning back to James. "What?" James blinked in confusion. Harold rolled his eyes. "Don't play dense. The girl Maya, she's single, intelligent, kind. You could do worse." James felt heat rise to his face. "Dad, that's not... I just met her yesterday." "So? I knew I wanted to marry your mother 20 minutes after we met." Harold shrugged. "Sometimes you just know." "I'm pretty sure Maya would object to being discussed like this," James said, trying to redirect the conversation. "Besides, she works for us. That would be complicated." Harold waved this concern away.
Details.
"Life is complicated. Doesn't mean you avoid the good parts." His expression grew suddenly serious. "Take it from someone who knows. Time goes faster than you think. Don't waste it." Before James could respond, Maya returned and the moment passed. But his father's words lingered, adding another layer to James's already complicated thoughts about the young woman who had somehow breached his father's isolation when no one else could. The day progressed with a trip to Harold's doctor, a routine appointment that Maya had apparently been handling alone. James insisted on coming along, partly out of concern for his father and partly out of a growing curiosity about the medical aspects of Harold's condition. The doctor seemed pleased to finally meet him, though James detected a note of gentle reproach in her comments about family support systems and emotional well-being. In the waiting room, while Harold was having some tests done, James found himself sitting beside Maya in uncomfortable plastic chairs. After a few minutes of silence, he cleared his throat. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for going above and beyond with my father. The agency reports have been positive, but seeing it firsthand..." He trailed off, searching for words that wouldn't sound like a performance review. "He's lucky to have you." Maya tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, looking slightly embarrassed. "I'm just doing my job." "No, you're not," James said firmly. "I've seen other caregivers just do their job. What you're doing is different." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "I saw you singing to him. On the security cameras." I saw how he responded. Maya's eyes widened slightly. "You've been watching?" "Not in a creepy way," James hastened to add. "Just checking in, making sure he was okay." It sounded inadequate even to his own ears. Maya seemed to consider this, her expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. "I started the music therapy informally," she said after a moment, "just noticing how certain songs affected his mood or cognitive state. Then I did some research and found studies on music's impact on dementia patients. Her eyes lit up with an enthusiasm that transformed her face. The results can be remarkable. Neuralpa. Thways activated by music often remain intact even as other cognitive functions decline. My father mentioned you've been keeping records. She nodded, looking slightly sheepish. Nothing formal. Just observations. Which pieces work best for different situations? How duration and timing affect the results? She hesitated. I hope that's okay. It's not exactly in my job description, but it seemed to help so much that I just kept going with it. It's more than okay, James assured her. It's extraordinary. He meant it. In the corporate world, he'd learned to recognize exceptional talent, people who saw beyond their assigned tasks to the larger purpose. Maya clearly fell into this rare category. Your father is the extraordinary one, she replied. Even on his worst days, there's this spark, this essential heraldness that the disease can't touch. Her voice grew softer. That's what I try to connect with through the music. That core person who's still there, just harder to reach sometimes. James felt a lump form in his throat. This was what had been missing from all the clinical reports and professional assessments. This recognition of his father as a person with a lifetime of experiences and knowledge and quirks. Not just a collection of symptoms to be managed. You see him, James said simply. Really see him? Maya met his gaze directly. Don't you? The question hung between them, honest but not accusatory. Before James could respond, a nurse called Harold's name, signaling the end of their private conversation. But the question followed James through the rest of the day, through dinner at Harold's favorite local restaurant, through the evening routine of medication, and settling his father into bed. It was still there as he drove back to his hotel, the night sky clear and star-filled above the familiar streets of his hometown. Did he see his father? The real person, not just the parent who had shaped his childhood or the patient described in medical reports. Or had he been avoiding looking too closely, afraid of what he might find or what he might have to acknowledge about himself? James didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in years, he was willing to ask the question. 3 years passed like the turning of pages in a well-loved book, sometimes slowly, sometimes in a rush, each chapter bringing its own joys and challenges. The senior center on Maple Street had once been an abandoned community building, its windows boarded and its future uncertain. Now on a bright spring morning, sunlight streamed through tall windows into a space filled with music and movement. A dozen elderly residents moved in time to a gentle rhythm, their faces alight with concentration and pleasure as Maya guided them through simple dance steps designed to improve balance and cognitive function. That's it, Mrs. Chen. Beautiful turn, Maya called encouragingly to a tiny woman whose movements, though limited by arthritis, showed remarkable grace. Now everyone join hands for the circle. Remember, left hand up, right hand down. At the piano nearby, Harold sat straight-backed and attentive, his fingers moving over the keys with careful precision. The melody was simple. He could no longer manage the complex pieces he'd once played, but the rhythm was steady, providing perfect accompaniment to the dance session. The disease had progressed as everyone knew it would. Harold's confusion was more frequent now, his lucid periods shorter. There were days when he didn't recognize his own home, when Maya's face seemed unfamiliar to him, when even music couldn't fully bring him back. But there were still good days, too. Moments of connection and clarity that everyone around him had learned to treasure, like today. Today was a good day. As the session ended and the participants dispersed for refreshments, Maya moved to the piano and placed a gentle hand on Harold's shoulder. That was perfect timing, she told him. You're getting really good at following the dancers. Harold looked up at her, his blue eyes clear and present. My mother made me take lessons for 8 years, he said. Hated every minute. Funny how useful it turned out to be. Maya smiled, helping him to stand. 3 years ago, he'd been able to manage most physical tasks independently. Now he needed support for even simple movements. His once tall frame more stooped, his steps more hesitant, but he insisted on coming to the center 4 days a week, on being part of the program rather than just a recipient of its services. Dad, that was great. James approached from the doorway where he'd been watching the session. His business attire, suit pants and a crisp button-down with rolled sleeves, stood out among the casual clothes of the center's staff and participants, but no one seemed to notice or care. They were used to seeing the tech executive drop in between meetings, fitting his corporate schedule around his father's activities. Harold brightened at the sight of his son. "James, I didn't know you were back from San Francisco." "Got in last night," James confirmed, taking his father's other arm to help him to a nearby chair. "The acquisition meetings finished early, so I caught the first flight home." He glanced at Maya, a silent message passing between them. Harold had been told about the trip 3 times yesterday alone, but the information hadn't stuck. "Don't need to point this out. Acquisition," Harold repeated, shaking his head slightly. "Always acquiring things. Just like your mother, she couldn't pass a bookshop without acquiring something." James laughed, the sound easy and natural. "I seem to remember your office at the university being so full of acquired journals that students had to move stacks just to find a place to sit." "That's different," Harold sniffed. "Those were essential research materials." "Of course they were," Maya agreed with mock seriousness, winking at James over Harold's head. "Just like my sheet music collection is all absolutely essential." "Now that," Harold said, pointing a slightly shaky finger at her, "is true. Music is always essential." This had become their shared philosophy, the cornerstone of the program that now operated in 5 locations across the county. What had begun as Maya's informal observations of music's effect on one patient had grown into a structured therapy program, serving hundreds of seniors with various degrees of cognitive impairment. The transformation had started small. A few months after James's unexpected return, he had approached Maya with a proposition. "I've been watching what you do with my father," he'd said during one of their now frequent evening conversations after Harold had gone to bed. "The music therapy, the documentation, the results. Have you ever thought about doing this on a larger scale?" Maya had laughed, assuming he was joking. "Sure, in the same way I've thought about performing at Carnegie Hall. Nice dream, but not exactly practical." But James hadn't been joking. With his business background and connections, combined with Maya's growing expertise and passion, the idea quickly evolved from conversation to concrete plan. The abandoned community center became available, grants were written, a board of directors formed. Within 8 months, the first participants were enrolled in what they called the Harmony Project, a music-based program for seniors with dementia and other cognitive challenges. Harold had been their first success story, though that felt like the wrong term to Maya. Success implied an endpoint, a goal achieved. What Harold experienced, what all their participants experienced, was an ongoing process of connection and engagement, of finding ways to remain present even as memory and cognition changed. Now, as the 3 of them sat together in the sunny corner of the center's main room, Maya could hardly believe how much had changed in 3 years. The frightened, confused man she'd first met had found a new purpose as the program's elder statesman and occasional pianist. The distant, work-obsessed son had discovered that his business skills could serve a mission beyond profit margins. And Maya herself had transformed from a reluctant caregiver to the director of a growing nonprofit, using her music in ways she'd never imagined during those discouraged days after college. "Lisa wants us all for dinner tonight," James said, referring to the center's administrative director. "She says she has news about the foundation grant." Maya felt a flutter of excitement. They'd applied for funding to expand their research component, to gather more formal data on the program's outcomes. "Did she give any hints?" "You know Lisa," James shrugged. "Everything by the book." But she sounded happy. Harold, who had been watching a bird at the feeder outside the window, turned back to them. "Who are we talking about?" "Lisa," Maya said patiently. "The center director. Tall woman with red hair. She invited us to dinner tonight." Harold frowned, then his face cleared. "The one with the cats." "That's right," James confirmed, exchanging a relieved glance with Maya. Sometimes these small moments of connection were enough to build on, to bridge the gaps in Harold's memory. "I like cats," Harold announced. "Elizabeth was allergic, so we never had one. Always wanted one, though." The mention of Elizabeth no longer brought the sharp pain it once had. 3 years had softened those edges for all of them. Harold spoke of his late wife often, sometimes as if she had just stepped out of the room, sometimes with the wistful awareness that she was long gone. Either way, Maya and James had learned to follow his alley, had to meet him where he was on any given day. "Maybe we should get a therapy cat for the center," Maya suggested. "I bet the participants would love that." James nodded thoughtfully. "I'll talk to Lisa about it." Could be good for everyone. He checked his watch. I've got a video call in 20 minutes. Dad, do you want to stay for the art class or head home for a rest? Harold considered this, his decision-making slower these days but still important to preserve whenever possible. Art class, he decided finally. That nice Chen lady will be there. Maya bit back a smile. Harold had developed a friendly flirtation with Mrs. Chen, a widow whose artistic talents had blossomed in the center's programs. It was sweet to see. A reminder that the need for human connection never really faded, regardless of age or circumstance. I'll get you settled before I leave, James said, helping his father to stand again. Maya watched them move slowly toward the art room, struck as always by the change in James. The sharp-edged, distant man she'd first met had softened. His focus shifted from acquisition deals to the more complex transactions of human connection. He still ran his company, still traveled for business, still maintained the drive that had made him successful. But his priorities had realigned in ways that surprised everyone, including himself. The professional boundaries between them had blurred and shifted too. Somewhere between late-night planning sessions for the center and shared vigils during Harold's hospitalizations, between heated debates over program methodology and quiet celebrations of small victories, they had become more than colleagues, friends first, their shared commitment to Harold creating a foundation of trust and mutual respect. Then something more, though neither had rushed to define it. Their first kiss had happened on the porch of Harold's cottage, after a particularly good day when he'd played the piano for nearly an hour without confusion or fatigue. The joy of that moment had spilled over, erasing the careful distance they'd maintained. Later they'd talked about the complications, her role as his father's caregiver, his position as her technical employer through the foundation he'd established to fund the center. But the connection between them had proven stronger than these concerns. Now 3 years on, they had found their rhythm. Maya lived in the cottage with Harold, providing the round-the-clock care he increasingly needed. James had purchased the house next door, close enough for daily involvement but maintaining the separate spaces they both valued. Their relationship had grown slowly, thoughtfully, neither willing to risk Harold's well-being or the program they'd built together by moving too quickly or carelessly. "Penny for your thoughts," James said, returning to find Maya still sitting where they'd left her. She smiled up at him. "Just thinking about how much has changed." "How much you've changed." He sat beside her, his shoulder warm against hers. "All for the better, I hope." "Mostly," she teased. "You still work too much," says the woman who was here until midnight planning the new outreach program. He took her hand, his fingers threading through hers with familiar ease. But point taken. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the activity around them. The center was busy today, art class in one room, a memory support group in another, staff moving purposefully between activities. What had begun as Maya's one-on-one experiments with Harold had grown into something neither of them could have imagined. "I got another call from the Rochester group," James said eventually. "They're still interested in replicating our model there." Maya nodded. This had been happening more frequently, requests from other communities wanting to establish similar programs. "What did you tell them?" "That we're developing training materials, that we'll share our research and methodology, but that we're focusing on solidifying our local centers before expanding further." He squeezed her hand gently. "That okay?" "Perfect." Maya appreciated that he always checked with her on these decisions, never assuming his business experience trumped her clinical perspective. It was one of many ways he'd grown beyond the controlling CEO who'd once watched his father through security cameras, rather than visiting in person. James glanced at his watch again and sighed. "I should go. This investor call won't reschedule itself." He stood, then bent to kiss her lightly. "See you at Lisa's tonight?" "I'll pick you and Dad up at 6. "We'll be ready," Maya promised. "Go make your millions so you can keep funding our little music project." He smiled at the old joke between them. While James's initial funding had been crucial, the program now operated primarily on grants and community support, a point of pride for Maya, who had insisted from the beginning that it needed to be sustainable beyond any single donor. After he left, Maya made her rounds through the center, checking in with staff and participants, handling the dozen small issues that always needed attention. By the time she returned to the art room to collect Harold, the afternoon was waning and most participants had already departed. She found him still at his easel, brush in hand, his focus complete. This was another gift of the program, discovering that Harold, with no prior artistic training, had a natural talent for watercolors. His paintings, while sometimes abstract due to his condition, carried an emotional resonance that had led to a small exhibition in the center's gallery. Today's painting showed a garden scene, flowers in bright blues and purples against a background of softer greens. Not his usual style, but beautiful in its simplicity. "That's lovely," Maya said, coming to stand beside him. "Is it finished?" Harold tilted his head, considering the painting with critical eyes. "Not quite." He added a few more brushstrokes, then nodded. "There. It's Elizabeth's garden. The way it used to look." Maya felt a familiar tightness in her throat. These moments of clarity, of connection to specific memories, had become rarer as the disease progressed. Each one felt precious now, a glimpse of the man beneath the confusion. "She would have loved it," she said softly. Harold set down his brush and looked up at her, his gaze suddenly direct and present in a way that still caught her by surprise. "She would have loved you too," he said. "And what you've done with the music. That was always her thing, you know, the healing power of art." Maya blinked back unexpected tears. "Thank you for saying that." Harold nodded, the moment of perfect lucidity already beginning to fade. "Is it time to go home?" "Yes," Maya said, helping him gather his things. "James is picking us up for dinner later, remember? With Lisa from the center?" "James," Harold repeated, the name clearly registering. "My son, he's a good boy. Better now that he's slowed down some." He glanced at Maya with a hint of his old shrewdness. "You're good for him. He's good for you too." "I think so," Maya agreed, touched by his observation. Even as other cognitive functions declined, Harold's emotional intelligence remained remarkably intact. He still saw people with the same insight that had characterized him before his diagnosis. As they walked slowly to the car, Harold leaning on Maya's arm, he began to hum softly, a tune she recognized as one of the first songs she'd ever sung to him. The memory of those early days washed over her. Her reluctance to take the caregiving job, her initial emotional distance, the gradual connection that had changed everything. If someone had told her then what would grow from those simple moments of singing to a confused old man, the program that now served hundreds, the relationship with James, the sense of purpose that filled her days, she would never have believed it. Life's most significant turns often came disguised as small moments, unrecognizable until viewed in retrospect. In the car, Harold's humming faded as he gazed out the window at the familiar streets. Maya drove carefully, aware of how precious her cargo was, not just physically fragile, but carrying within him the seeds of everything that had blossomed in her life these past 3 years. "You were singing," Harold said suddenly, his voice soft but clear, "that day when James was watching. You didn't know he could see you." Maya glanced at him, surprised. "That's right. On the security cameras." Harold nodded, satisfied. Changed everything, that moment. For all of us. His hand, spotted with age and trembling slightly, reached over to pat hers on the steering wheel. "Some things happen for a reason, I think." As they pulled into the driveway of the cottage that had become home, Maya considered Harold's words. She wasn't sure about reasons or fate or grand designs, but she knew that small acts of kindness and connection could ripple outward in unexpected ways. A song offered in a moment of confusion. A son watching from afar, finally finding his way home. A reluctant caregiver discovering her true calling. "I think you might be right," she said, helping Harold from the car. Together, they made their way slowly up the familiar path to the blue cottage where their story had begun.